My name is Melanie DiLorenzo, and I am the chair of the Connections Lecture Series. We have a Connections lecture once every semester. But before we get started here, I wanted to acknowledge some special guests that we have. Of course, all of our students and faculty, but also President Herbert is here with us today, and Provost Mahon. Did I say that right? Close enough, okay. And then also, I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge the people who work behind the scenes to make this happen. So our communications team, of which there's a couple representatives here, Lee Cody and David Daddiago, thank you so much for all your hard work. Also the facilities team, they clean things up, the housekeeping team as well, gets everything set up for us. And these are wonderful, reliable people, and I couldn't have done it without them. And then last but not least, my admin support, Joe Baslow from the School of Mathematical and Physical Sciences. Thank you so much. To get things started, I am going to introduce the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, Wes Renfro. He's going to talk to you a little bit about the mission and purpose of the Connections Lecture Series.
Good afternoon and welcome. I'm the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our Fall Connections Lecture. For those of you who are attending for the first time, this series seeks to foster interdisciplinary exploration by connecting individuals with diverse perspectives, aiming to inspire discussions that challenge conventional thinking while encouraging individuals to envision new possibilities at the intersection of ideas. And that sentence is a mouthful, but I think that if you think about it, it is very much at the core of all of our business at UNE. Our speaker today is Dr. Helen Rozwadowski. She's a professor of history at the University of Connecticut and is founder of the Maritime Studies program at UConn Avery Point. We were just having a discussion. Avery Point is lovely, it's beautiful, it is coastal. It is not quite as beautiful as our location, but it is pretty nice indeed. She graduated from Williams College and received her MA and Ph.D. from the University of Pennsylvania. Her teaching includes environmental history, the history of science, and public history, as well as interdisciplinary maritime studies. Her work helps illustrate the powerful links between humans and the oceans. Her talk, Fathoming How History Can Save the Oceans, exemplifies the spirit of this series and is very on brand for the College of Arts and Sciences and the University of New England. Please join me in giving her a warm UNE welcome. And finally, thanks to everybody behind the scenes, as well as Melanie DiLorenzo, who helped organize this wonderful event. It's noted and appreciated.
Thank you all. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you all for being here. It's really, really fun to be here. At the very end of my talk, I have a slide showing you my campus, so you'll get to compare for yourself. I do think your campus is very, very beautiful. Today, I'm going to try to convince you that history can help us save the oceans. I probably don't need to tell an audience of people who goes to school in a place like this how much the state of global oceans has been in the news and of concern among environmentalists and many other people in recent years. And in the face of environmental concern, of course, often the reaction is to call for more science. And it is true that we need science, good science, and for people to understand and accept it. And I'll say more about that in a minute. But solving our ocean problems, I believe, is going to require more than that. And I'm going to try to explain to you today how history is integral. There we go. So I'm going to start by reflecting a little bit on how we know the oceans. I'm a historian of science. I'm often asking questions about how people in the past have come to know the natural world. And the word that kind of is most often historically associated with the act of knowing the oceans, or at least with knowing what's underwater, is the word fathoming. So what is a fathom? It's a unit of measurement for measuring the depth of water. And like the foot, it's a unit that was originally based on the human body for scale. So a fathom, how many people know what a fathom is? Yeah, it's 6 feet. It's the average arm span of an adult human male. And the idea was that navigators would sound or measure depth by throwing a line, which is a rope when you're using it on a boat, a line with a weight attached to it overboard, and when it hits the ground, you measure 1 fathom of line at a time, right? Counting it up. Now, fathom evokes science and technology and began to evoke that even more when navigators started figuring out how to mark sounding lines so that they could drop a line overboard and measure very deep water without having to do it 1 fathom at a time, which obviously wouldn't make sense. But all the humanists in the room get to smile now. Fathom has another meaning as well, the act of trying to understand a difficult problem after much thought. And this fathom invokes the imagination. So I'm going to try to show you that it is essential to leverage the imagination alongside science and other ways of knowing the ocean in order to know and to save the oceans. So knowledge about the oceans, both in the past and today, has been created through experience. Beyond shallow waters, that experience is indirect, requiring various tools and skills, knowledge systems, representations of various kinds. Yesterday's sounding lines and meticulous hand-done charting have become today's autonomous vehicles beaming back data to our labs. The indirect nature of our knowledge about oceans means that imagination and media and aesthetics, things like that, loom large in shaping our understanding of the oceans. As the early environmentalist Rachel Carson put it, to sense this world of waters known to the creatures of the sea, we must shed our human perceptions of length and breadth and time and place and enter vicariously into a universe of all-pervading water. That entering vicariously, of course, meant that Carson, who was a scientist as well as a writer, recognized the importance of the imagination. So here is an outline for our voyage today. I'm going to start by thinking through what we need to solve, what we need in order to solve ocean challenges. And obviously we need good science and technology, but I hope I can convince you that the humanities, this area called the blue humanities, can provide some important help. The blue humanities is a fast-growing field right now, and I'm going to tell you most especially about the part of the blue humanities that I know about ocean histories. And I'll explain what ocean histories are. I'll also tell you a little bit about how I came to be an ocean historian, and how I'm going to talk briefly about 3 case studies that are examples of ways that ocean histories added to science and other things helped lead the way to certain kinds of ocean solutions, if you will. All right, so I want to emphasize, this is my disclaimer, how important science and technology are. I am not at all the kind of person who's tearing down science here. And I want to be very clear about that because I'm a historian of science. I worry a lot about science denial. I worry a lot about the erosion of trust in science. And it's something that I and other of my colleagues in the history of science spend a lot of time thinking about and writing about and focusing on. But as you'll see, I think that the humanities can be made to work in tandem with the sciences and also with the social sciences in ways that would lead to more effective ocean solutions. All right, so having said that, I'm going to say a few things about some of the reasons why ocean science, or the way we use ocean science, is not working maybe as well as it could. So it is a common lament of today's ocean scientists that so little of the oceans have been studied. How many people have heard or read something like this Blue Planet quote? We know more about the surface of Mars than we do about the deep oceans. I'm seeing lots of nodding, right? This is something, the earliest example of which that I and other people have found is from 1953, when the British oceanographer George Deacon, quoting Sir Edward Buller, who was a founder of the field of marine geophysics, said, "We know more about the surface of the moon than we know about the deep sea." This comparison of the ocean's depths to alien worlds does not, I think you would agree if you think about this, inspire the appropriate sense of the incredible relevance of the oceans to life on this planet. We don't want to think about the oceans as an alien world. That's not as productive as it could be. Comparison of our knowledge of oceans, and especially the depths and the seafloor, to the state of knowledge of the moon or Mars, intends to emphasize how little is known about oceans. Fair. The deep sea biologist Alan Jameson criticizes the rampant use of this analogy by scientists and especially by the media. In addition to being a 70-year-old analogy, so one criticism is that we have 70 years more of information about the oceans and we're still saying the same thing. We would never say that about land. But Alison Jameson also considers this comparison absurd for other reasons. And one of the things that he points to is that thousands of people have visited the deep sea in manned submersibles. 15 of them reached depths greater than 7,000 meters before the first person ever stood on the moon. So that's something to pause and think about. Jameson similarly chides scientists and the media for constantly saying that long-known facts are surprising. So 2 examples from the Blue Planet 2 of the photic zone. Incredibly, there is life here. Of a snailfish in the Mariana Trench. No one imagined that an animal as complex as a fish could exist in such extreme pressures. So in reality, both of these things, that life exists at the great depths and that life includes complex animals like fish, have been known for more than 100 years. This strategy of contrived mystery, I think, does a disservice by suggesting that the ocean is unknown and perhaps unknowable, when in fact, we do know some things about the ocean. Right now, historians and ocean scientists are celebrating the 150th anniversary of the circumnavigation of the HMS Challenger, which was the first major effort to study the global oceans scientifically. And handily for historians, a 3.5-year circumnavigation voyage leads to 3.5 years of anniversary celebrations. So we've been at this for a while. So many historians are thinking about this. And one of the things that I want to say about this Challenger anniversary is that rather than despairing that we don't know enough, one lesson to draw from something as old as the Challenger is to look to the ocean knowledge we have and try to summon the optimism mixed with an appropriate amount of humility. There are things about the ocean we know and we can conclude with confidence, and these can form the basis for precautionary policies. This is a sort of, and many scientists would agree with what I'm saying, that we do need to learn more about oceans, but we also know enough that we probably can make some reasonable policies based on what we do know. So the question is, why don't we do that? And the answer has to do with people, right? All right. So recently, a group of scientists has emphasized the importance of the planetary scale, advocating what they call the Drop the S campaign. They argue for the importance of emphasizing that there is one world ocean rather than plural oceans. And this call has been taken up by scientists and by environmentalists. And this sounds pretty reasonable, right? One global ocean, anything you do in one place affects the whole system. But we might stop to ask ourselves, even if we understand the value of recognizing a singular global ocean, what are we losing if we drop that S? Historians and other humanists doubt the notion that using a singular ocean can lead to the needed behavioral and political change to solve our present ocean challenges. And so I'm going to try to tell you why I think plural oceans and plural ocean histories will help us get to our ultimate goal of better oceans. So as much as we do know about oceans, the need to know more about them, I mean, I did say all that, is increasingly urgent with climate and other changes that are well underway. Again, I probably don't need to rehearse this for an audience at a campus like this, but the problem of plastics and other pollutants in the ocean, the problem of warming oceans and the associated problem of sea level rise, ocean acidification, and so on. The circumnavigation ideal, the planetary scale, remains essential for understanding the ocean and the environmental roles it plays in making our planet a place where life can be. It provides, though, a less than ideal perspective for solving anthropocentric ocean challenges. Another way to say this is that more and more science alone is not going to solve these problems because, as I indicated a moment ago, these are human problems. The actual solving of them are human problems. We need, therefore, to add humanities to the mix. Some people refer to what we need as the blue humanities, and ocean histories are a part of this field. The blue humanities are wider than that. They encompass humanistic work in literary scholarship, media studies, anthropology, art history. There's a lot of people doing really interesting, artists are getting involved. So blue humanities is capacious. And I'm going to talk today more specifically about ocean history and ocean histories, and including the kind of choice that I make to keep the ocean histories in the plural. The singular ocean contradicts historical reality for many, if not most of the people around the world and over all of the time that people have been connected to oceans. People experience ocean waters on local or regional scales, not on the global scale. Different cultures have distinct relationships with their oceans that emerge from the intersection of several things: their knowledge of the sea, the uses they make of its surface and living and non-living resources, their cultural perceptions and engagements with the sea. And those relationships are not static. They change over time, even as some elements may remain constant. And I'm going to give you some more details to flesh out some of these pictures later on. Moreover, the ocean's vast size and inaccessibility prompts the use of representations, including narratives, images, and metaphors to know it, both its materiality and also the variety of meanings it holds for different groups of people at different times. The historian Emma Zarowski has pointed out that Challenger scientists turn to representing the ocean with graphs and charts and tables. Remember the Challenger's 1870s, right? Because traditional ways of representing the natural world failed to work for the deep sea. As a result, she argues, the ocean could not be represented visually as a scientific space and therefore remained one of fantastical imagination into the 20th century. And a good piece of evidence to support this is that this sketch of mermaids was included in the Challenger scientific report. Just says a lot, right? Okay, so the humanities make it possible to deal with the ocean's characteristics of vastness and opacity and tracklessness. On the left, you see some pictures that I've found of scars on the landscape of the American West left from the wheels of settlers who traversed the Oregon Trail. By contrast, the wake of boats, unless there's a sheet of ice in the middle, is ephemeral. Now, people like physical and chemical oceanographers can render the vast trackless ocean comprehensible by measuring temperature differences or minute amounts of particles, and kind of tell us something about the ocean. Historians can do the same thing. Historians can use archival and other sources to recover activities that took place on or in oceans in the past that otherwise might disappear from our understanding of the past, like a boat's wake. History has long been a rather terrestrially biased field. As you might recognize, if you think back on, most high school history classes that you took, although I'm super delighted to learn here that we have a class called Inventing the Oceans, where people here on this campus are learning ocean history. Very good, very exciting. I also know people teaching ocean history classes in places as landlocked as the University of Wisconsin at La Crosse. So people are starting to do more of this, which is super exciting. So I want to tell you a little bit about how I started writing ocean histories, because I think it will help you see something about the approach I've taken to ocean histories. You might be surprised to learn, except for the few people I've already told about this, that I grew up far from the oceans. And I think that has influenced the way that I approach ocean history. I grew up in the Great Lakes in Erie, Pennsylvania, which is the little tiny part of Pennsylvania, which is the dark green state, right on Lake Erie. I had sort of a landlocked childhood, but I included this cartoon from the young Jeremy who grew up in central Ohio as a coastal soul in a landlocked family, having this kind of imaginative relationship with the ocean to kind of telegraph my experience with the ocean was really filtered through sailing small boats on Lake Erie, reading Moby Dick, which I don't know, I thought I understood at the time, but maybe I did, maybe I didn't. But I had this kind of fascination for the ocean, even though I never saw the ocean until I was 11 years old, and never saw it again until I was 20. So I had this whole kind of experience that set me up and got me interested in oceans as a historian. And I had very little knowledge of the actual ocean, that's how I like to say it, which is probably really different from a lot of people here. And I think my perspective prompted me to pay attention to imagination and cultural understandings of oceans, and to take those kinds of things as sources of knowledge about the ocean more seriously than people who grow up being very familiar with actual oceans. And I'll maybe give you some examples of that as we go along. All right, so then fast forward to the mid-1990s, I was working on my dissertation, and I was asked to review an environmental exhibit called Ocean Planet that was designed to spur visitors to take action to protect the ocean. It was, its curators described it as an activist exhibit. They wanted it to make people change their behavior. And this experience opened my eyes to the danger of leaving the humanities, and in particular, in this case, history, out of the business of articulating and trying to solve the ocean's challenges. So this exhibit had a lot of interactive elements, and it conveyed information and arguments about the environmental crises of the ocean, I thought, very effectively and certainly convincingly. But the exhibit creators wanted to expand the exhibit beyond science and technology and environmentalism. So they had this major section on human interactions with the sea. And one example of that was a section that focused on memorials to fishers who died at sea from 3 different cultures, encompassing both traditional and industrial fisheries, and from 3 very different parts of the world. And this strategy was quite successful at emphasizing the commonalities among disparate cultures and across time, but it came at the cost of erasing cultural differences and effacing historical change. And I felt that this section worked in tension with the rest of the exhibit, because this section was communicating a sense of timelessness, whereas the exhibit was trying to create a sense of urgency and timeliness, and they just didn't reinforce each other very well. So my dissertation eventually became the book Fathoming the Oceans. I had started out trying to write the prehistory of the Challenger expedition to understand where the interest and the ability to study the deep sea in the 19th century came from. And as I was writing it, I realized that I was also writing a history of the deep sea, both the actual place and how and why the scientists studied it, but also how the depths were understood culturally in this time period in which the United States and Britain were gaining the ability to find out how deep the deepest parts of the ocean were, install submarine telegraph cables, the time when Jules Verne was writing his imaginative books, including 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and people were starting to have aquariums in their homes and think about the underwater in a cultural way for the first time. So this glimpse of the possibility of writing the ocean's history developed over the course of my career into the confidence that ocean histories could be written, and the conviction that we really need more of them. We need more ocean histories. And that is what led me to write my most recent book, Vast Expanses, A History of the Oceans, which is, frankly, an effort to proselytize the act of writing the ocean histories and get more people to do them. And I'll show you some of the results in a minute. So the need to address ocean challenges, as I mentioned before, has become more critical, and I think that is especially true since the 1990s, when I started my career. One of the things that happened in the 1990s was not only the crash of the cod stocks in the Northwest Atlantic, but even more surprisingly to observers who assumed, painful as it was, that closing those fisheries would allow those stocks to recover, to discover that they didn't do that. They didn't recover. And it took about a decade for fishery scientists to kind of figure out why. And it had to do with the fact that fishing had changed the ocean. Changed the stock structure and things like that. The other issue, of course, that has directed our attention to oceans is climate change and the need to devote a little more attention to understanding the role that the ocean plays in moderating climate and what happens when things in that system start changing, like global warming. All right. In late 2019, the International Panel for Climate Change released its special report on ocean and cryosphere, which concluded that the world ocean, along with the cryosphere, has, quote, taken the heat, both literally and figuratively, and that urgent action is needed. So this is something that's been building and is now quite clearly recognized as a problem. So you might be wondering, how exactly can ocean histories help? One thing to point out is that historians have begun writing ocean histories. These are some recent and very, very good ocean histories. I've mentioned a few of them in the class that I met with earlier today and with other people I've met on campus today. The point here is that we are beginning to learn about specific human-ocean relationships in particular places involving specific cultures and one or another time periods, including there's some early modern works in this list and others that are on the way. So that's good. We're having a better sense of how different cultures have different relationships with oceans. In addition to more, and I'm not sorry about the terrible pun here, and specific ocean histories, attention to history can alert us to powerful and dangerous metaphors from the past that continue to shape perceptions and uses of the ocean in the present. So this is a quote, to give you just a taste of this, from 1964. It says, "Of the two great frontiers, space and the oceans, being opened up in the 20th century, only the ocean is close, tangible, and of direct personal significance to every man, woman, and child on the face of the globe. Another war might be won or lost in its depths rather than in outer space. It is a cornucopia of raw materials for man's industries, food for his stomach, health for his body, challenges to his mind, and, perhaps most surprisingly, inspiration to his soul. So this was written by someone named Seabrook Hull, an engineer and author of a popular book about new uses anticipated for the ocean in the post-World War II period. This frontier metaphor was very commonly applied to oceans in this period. And I'll tell you, I've also looked in granular detail through the 1950s and 60s, and the frontier metaphor was applied to the oceans a little bit before it was applied to space. But it was very often, especially in the 1960s, that these two places, outer space and the deep oceans, were considered together. As you see from this quote, oceans were a place that could satisfy virtually all, if not all, of humanity's physical needs, but also spiritual needs. Thanks. And are there any historians or people who've studied enough history in the room to have heard of somebody named Frederick Jackson Turner? Yeah, a few people. So this is very much comparing the ocean to the kind of space that historians from the early 20th century understood the US West to be in the late 19th centuries, as a place that was going to kind of provide economic, but even more so political and spiritual resources for the growing United States nation. And that metaphor was just kind of moved over and applied to the oceans in the post-World War II period. And so here are some images that suggest the range of anticipated new uses for the ocean in the 1950s and 60s. And you'll notice they include things like transportation and food, which are kind of old-fashioned ways of using the ocean. They anticipate the increase that happened in recreational uses, and they extend to a vision of industrialization of the oceans themselves. And some of these industries happened, like offshore oil and gas. Others, like ranching whales, not so much, but that's a rather literal version of the frontier metaphor if I've ever seen one. And note, I just want to emphasize to you, look at the lower right picture. This is a vision of ocean industrialization that was anticipated, people were excited about. There was no critique of the idea of industrializing the ocean. This was something people were equating with progress and looking forward to. The ocean frontier metaphor became entrenched and pervasive. The top picture shows you just a selection of books. And if you go to a library that has a lot of books from the 1950s and 60s, you'll find a couple shelves of books whose titles all evoke this ocean frontier image. Observers in the 1950s and 60s anticipated the inevitable and speedy inauguration of new modes of work and travel and recreation and even life undersea. This sketch accompanied an engineering design proposal for an offshore structure that was planned but never built at Scripps Institution of Oceanography for the so-called Man in the Sea program. And boy, analyzing primary sources can be super duper fun. Notice on the seafloor, you have that space age looking structure that looks like something out of the Jetsons, for those of you who remember the Jetsons. And then look to the right. It's a log cabin. And then kind of look over to the left, a cactus, right? So these kind of imaginaries of the ocean as this kind of frontier were just so pervasive and so influential. All right. So the frontier metaphor is newly relevant now, I'm sorry to say, due to renewed interest in deep sea mining for minerals needed to support decarbonization. As any historian would recognize, the metaphor carries with it powerful assumptions and messages. The historical reference to the US Western frontier specifically implies that oceans are valuable primarily for their economic resources of interest to humans. Frontier applied to the deep sea also suggests the lawlessness of this place, whereby Those with the power and the ability to operate in the depths can and should be able to assert their will. And further, it implies the inevitability of development as an inexorable outcome of so-called progress. That is, it seems inconceivable not to develop this resource, regardless of the likely terrible environmental effects of deep sea mining. So that's the power that a metaphor can have. It can bundle up all of those assumptions and leave them unpacked, and the humanities can help us unpack them. Historians, including me, have begun to call attention to how people in the past used metaphors to express their understandings and ambitions for using the ocean, and what kinds of legacies those metaphors had. Wilderness is an example of another metaphor that calls for historical critique. The prevalent conception of wilderness, of course, is a place untouched by humans. Widespread discovery of plastics in the mid-oceans and on the sea floor makes clear that even the deep oceans and the deep sea are far from untouched. Rather than thinking of oceans as wilderness places that are separate from humans, we need new metaphors that can support more sustainable and more just treatments of oceans. And maybe some of the students here will be the ones to help create those metaphors. Another powerful insight gained from looking backward to the past holds great promise for ocean conservation. In 1995, the fisheries scientist Daniel Pauly introduced what he called the shifting baselines syndrome. He observed, very simply, that his generation of fisheries scientists used as the starting point for all of their research the stock size and species composition of the catches that were being made by fishermen at the start of their careers. And they did this for a good reason. They wanted their data to be comparable over time, and they didn't want to use data that was maybe collected using different technology, which might not be comparable. But this choice had the unintended effect of ignoring past ocean knowledge. Others observed the same pattern as held true for fisheries scientists, held true for people who fished as well. So the pictures on the right show you the sizes of fish landed at a single Florida dock for charter boats between 1956 and 1979. And you can see that the sizes of the fish went down dramatically. Pauly's message was that we must find a way to enlarge our time scale. Reference points from the 1950s, the start of Pauly's career, ignore depletions from the first half of the 20th century and from much earlier, the early modern period, for example. Pauly has a great TED Talk, by the way, in which he shows an animated version, which I have got a still screenshot of here, of a recreation of what the Chesapeake Bay was like 1,000 years ago when it had whales, something that is really hard for us to imagine today. If we were setting conservation goals for the Chesapeake Bay, imagine how different they would look if we use knowledge embedded in this picture versus knowledge from data that began in 1950. Very different picture. All right, so 3 cases that illustrate how ocean histories can help with ocean conservation and restoration. Case 1, the Billion Oyster Project. Has anybody ever heard of this project? Okay, good, a few people. It's a citizen science project with the goal of restoring oysters to New York Harbor by 2035. I think they're making a lot of progress. I'm not sure exactly if they're on track or not. But it's a great program. It engages school children. It's part of a STEM initiative. And it was inspired by a project that I want to tell you a little more about, the Oyster Recovery Project from the Chesapeake, which began in the 1990s with an emphasis on science, as well as the involvement of watermen, which is the name for mariners in the Chesapeake, and conservation organizations, but which also involved history. So restoration ecology got involved in asking questions about the past when the people working on the Chesapeake Bay had to choose a restoration goal. They had to ask themselves and answer the question, To what point in time will we try to restore the Chesapeake Bay? Help came in the 1990s from an innovative partnership between historians and ecologists called HMAP, the History of Marine Animal Populations, which was part of a 10-year census of marine life that tried to figure out what did, what does, and what will live in the sea, past, present, and modeling for the future. Help also came from work by historians of science who guided us to understand more about past knowledge creation about the Chesapeake Bay and how that knowledge was used. And recently, that historical knowledge contributed to a documentary called A Passion for Oysters, which is available on YouTube. And I'll say more about the scientist in a minute. Case 2, the resumption or continuation of Aboriginal whaling in communities that had historically relied on whales as important resources. In 2004, I had the opportunity to attend a conference in what was then called Barrow, Alaska, which has now been renamed back to its original Inuit name, Ukvikviak. There I became aware of the emerging understanding by Western scientists of the importance of paying attention to indigenous knowledge of the natural world. And I'm the third one from the right there in the jacket with the bright yellow bits, a much younger version of me, that is. In 1977, I learned the International Whaling Commission set a zero quota for bowhead whales based on a scientific survey of the bowhead population. As you can see from the New York Times headline, this very much upset the indigenous hunters in this area. Indigenous Alaska whaling captains thought the numbers were much higher. They formed the Alaska Eskimo Whaling Commission. They did their own survey. They hired scientists, and they demonstrated that federal researchers had been undercounting whales based on incorrect assumptions about whale behavior, and therefore where they could be seen to be counted. They push back because bowhead whales are the most culturally significant resource to coastal Inupiat who have been hunting them for thousands of years. In other words, the Inupiat and the bowhead have a historical relationship which is known and communicated by elders and teachers to younger generations. This historical relationship provides the context for present co-management of this resource. Other indigenous communities have similarly close and long-standing relationships with the ocean. The historian Joshua Reed has written a wonderful book about the Makah tribal nation that shows how marine space was always considered part of their territory, hence the title of his book, The Sea is My Country, a quote from a treaty document. Their relationship with the sea has formed the locus of personal and group identity since long before the arrival of Euro-American fur traders in the 18th century. This relationship continues to the present and animates their recent efforts to regain control over their customary fishing and whaling rights. Case 3, Hokulea. In 1975, the Polynesian double-hulled voyaging canoe, Hokulea, was launched to initiate a program to revive voyaging and rediscover Native Hawaiian special cultural relationship with the sea. In the 1960s, a group of sailor scholars began trying to unlock the secrets of traditional Pacific navigation by studying with expert navigators, conducting experimental voyaging on traditional and replica vessels, and also modern sailing craft, and also by drawing on oral histories. With the help from the Micronesian navigator Pias Mau Pialug, Hawaiians rediscovered knowledge of navigation. They reevaluated their relationship to their island home, and they connected with other voyaging cultures throughout Oceania, some that still practice traditional navigation and some that have lost the tradition. And in 2017, Hokulea completed a 3-year circumnavigation that extends its program's mission from voyaging and navigation to include an explicit environmental focus that recognizes the island properties of the planet Earth. So, to conclude, I'll point out some of the things these 3 cases have in common. Unlike land, people can only know the sea indirectly. I argue that knowledge of the oceans then is mediated by technology and knowledge systems including those of fishers and navigators, but also including those of modern scientists. The knowledge gained is used to exploit oceanic resources, living, non-living, but also resources such as connectivity. But remember that I have said more than once that not all knowledge of the ocean is gained that way. Although science and technical knowledge of navigation are in the foreground in all these three cases, attention to the past in each case was and remains equally important. Understanding past ecosystems and recognizing past and continuing cultural, spiritual, and economic relationships between groups of people and the oceans provided the key in these cases to diagnosing problems and articulating effective solutions, and aimed to address and did address both environmental and social and cultural challenges. So a second thing that jumps out is that knowledge, whether about nature or about history, was in each case co-produced by community members and expert specialists. In the case of knowledge about the natural world, we might use the term citizen science. But equally important is the co-production of knowledge about the past. Historians such as Joshua Reed and Christine Kiner are scholars who have written their histories with traditional sources that historians use, archival, documents, other primary sources. But both of them have also partnered with the people whose history they studied. So Christine Kiner and the documentary makers of Passion for Oysters worked with watermen and also worked with the scientists, and Christine studied the scientists from earlier in the 20th century. And Joshua Reed worked closely with the Makah tribal nation. The term for this is public history or public humanities. Third, these three cases have in common that they illustrate ways that history can hold a key to a better present and/or future relationships, a set of relationships with the oceans, involving both healthier marine ecosystems and healthier human communities. So I hope that I've convinced you that history can be a tool to help us save the oceans. The reason for this is that we know the oceans as much through imagination as through technology and knowledge systems. If we tackle present ocean challenges with as much attention to culture and history as to the physical, chemical, and so on characteristics of the oceans, we will be better able to come up with solutions that work effectively and justly for both oceans and people. Thank you.
So we do have some time for some Q&A. And I believe you can just reach over and press the button and talk into the microphone at your table. Is that right? We'll try it.
And that's my campus, by the way, in case you didn't figure it out.
You don't have, oh.
Hello, does this work?
Yes.
Thank you for your wonderful lecture. I'm Susan McHugh. I teach Literatures of the Sea here, among other classes. And I really would love to hear you say more about Hokulea. I happened to be in Honolulu when it came back, and it's just such an amazing project. And I noticed, too, that the photo that you included a couple of times includes both the Hawaiian and the U.S. flag. I think the history behind Hokulea, I think everybody could benefit from learning a bit more about that. So thank you.
Oh, I don't know how much of the whole history I can do justice because it's not something I have researched myself personally. But I mean, I suppose you're probably referring to, Hawaii as very much, having a colonial relationship with the United States and the kind of political achievement in addition to the other achievements I talked about that Hokulea represents. I will say, and this is sort of bigger than Hawaii, when I teach about ocean histories, I really make a point of talking about the anthropologist Apele Hawafa who made the observation, the argument that people in Oceania consider the world they live in seas of islands instead of the way Westerners, Europeans, especially some of the first generations of people to explore the Pacific, had a very hard time in the Pacific. They died of scurvy. They didn't know how to tell longitude. They wandered around. They couldn't find any of these islands, that these people who lived there had no trouble finding, of course. And they developed the Western perception of this area of the Pacific as being these kind of tiny, impoverished pieces of land, surrounded by ocean, which is a completely different perspective. And Apele Hawafa's vision of seas of islands, or recognition of that vision, is not only a past vision, but a present vision. He says that people of Oceania still move around, now sometimes on airplanes. They're very mobile. They're comfortable being part of an island. They're comfortable being part of other parts of the world. They have a very different relationship to their island home than the Western perception of that area. And so there is a really important political valence to this traditional voyaging, in addition to just the kind of a marvel at learning how this navigation happened.
So there's a political scientist that I really like who they announced today won one of the MacArthur Fellowships, Henry Hahn. And her work is about, what does it take to transform regular people into active citizens and activists? And it really focuses on, it's always rooted in some personal experience that gives them a sense of some, mastery of some aspect of the world that they feel competent to speak about in public and to work on. And I get a little bit of that from your work where, people have personal experiences of the ocean. They can't think of a one planetary ocean like they have. Right. The water's near them, and that experience matters. But it does seem to me that with the ocean, people can have that, and they can have a sense of the crisis in the ocean near them, or their relationship to the ocean near them. But the ocean does have inevitably this vast interconnected quality that we can only imagine. Yeah. And certainly one thing that Hahn finds, and like Christopher Lash writes about this too, is whenever we're acting politically on things we can only imagine, that's when our politics gets the craziest and angriest and most destructive. Uh-huh. And so I just wonder if there's like something fundamental about our ability to act collectively in the ocean, that the mysteriousness is always going to make it hard to feel like we're competent to do it or to do it right.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I co-wrote an article with two social scientists who were experts in kind of behavior and how you change behavior. We came together because of my work on plural ocean histories. And the argument that we made was that, if you want to generate political behavioral change, you're better off if you leverage people's familiarity with their own ocean, because they're going to be working on the Baltic Sea, which is where they live, for example. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't not teach people that there's only one world ocean. I mean, I think it's important to convey that. But at the level of getting people to make effective change, the idea is that you need to kind of start with where people are in terms of their cultural or societal engagement with their own oceans as a starting point. And I think, and I'm not a social scientist, so I'm definitely not an expert in the behavior scholarship that was sort of embedded in that. But it certainly makes sense to me, and I certainly think that history bears out that different groups of people have different leverages or priorities, that could be called upon, and so that kind of makes sense to me. But I really think that your suggestion that one of the problems is the bigness of the ocean being kind of, that's a very interesting idea, and I would like to think more about that. Yeah, I think that's possible. It's a little an echo of what Rozwadowski was saying about the Challenger in the 19th century. You know, these scientists just were kind of at a loss to how to convey information about the ocean the same way they did about things they were used to studying. And you know, they kind of, I mean, they turned to graphs, and other people turned to other kinds of representations. The 19th century was full of efforts to say, well, we'll just make charts of magnetic variation, or we'll make charts of tides, or we'll make charts of this or that, because it was a problem. It's a challenge.
I'm not quite sure exactly how to frame this as a question. When you met with the students earlier in a class talking about marine law, I was struck by, in vast expanses, of course, you are sort of proselytizing the importance of getting over terrestrial bias. And as you were talking about law, I was struck by the fact that all of the laws in, well, legal frameworks in general are entirely defined by terrestrial bias. And then Brian's question brings up the same kind of a thing. We seem to have this inability to conceive of something so large. How do we get beyond that? How do we get to a point where we can conceive of this thing as something other than frontier, other than unexplored wilderness, other than, and simply part of this planet that involves all of these interconnected systems?
Yeah. I don't know if I have a good answer for that, but I do believe that if we could come up with metaphors that got beyond, progress and control and conquest, we'd be well on our way. I think a lot of our orientation toward the ocean is still steeped in a kind of early modern posture toward the ocean that was then kind of layered on top with 19th century, optimism or worse. This kind of sense of technological control, and now we talk about prediction, and all of that. I mean, modeling is important, but somehow finding a way to replace, those kind of old, but very powerful and hard to shake ways of thinking about the natural world is, I think it would get us really, really far. I mean, for example, when was the terrestrial environmental movement? 1960s and 70s, right? When was ocean environmentalism? Really not till the 21st century, 50 years later, right? Bits and pieces before, save the whales, sure, dolphins save tuna, but worry about the entire ocean, 21st century. We fished all the cod, and climate change is also changing the oceans. That was sort of really the beginning of people wrapping their heads around the fact that we could affect the oceans the same way we have clearly for a long time affected land. Just, it's hard. Maybe you have an idea.
Which Rachel Carson had a chapter on in whatever year.
I know, right? Yeah, terrestrial bias, it's a problem. But the optimist in me says, I mean, look at how many, I showed you all those there are many more now than, there's a bunch in being published now. Those of you who are historians, the HNet, which is the kind of way that historians get information about things, now has a channel called H Oceans. Sign up for it. You'll get lots of book reviews about books related to oceans. You'll find out about conferences and opportunities and things related to ocean history. It's becoming a thing. So I'm hopeful.
I just wanted to thank you for amplifying Indigenous voices in this. Early, like in the early 90s, mid 90s, I was pretty heavily involved in conservation biology. And in the journal Conservation Biology, one of the editors, who was a white male scientist, published an opinion piece about how the naturalists were dying off, right? And myself and a colleague wrote a response, and we were like, they're not dying off. The white ones are. But the people in the communities where we worked, mostly in South America and Central America, they knew about their areas. They knew about the animals that lived there.
Yeah.
They were truly naturalists in that sense.
Yeah.
So I wanted to thank you for that, because I think many people in science, that's changing now. We see more indigenous peoples participating actively in science at discussion. So I really appreciate this perspective, and I thank you for it.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, I teach a global environmental history, which is also terrestrial. And that is such an important theme, I think, for recognizing and indigenous knowledge and also local knowledges. I mean, people who live in places know them. I mean, that's, yeah, so, yeah.
I just wanted to say, I really appreciate you coming out here and like just talking about a lot of this like nautical history stuff. Where I'm from Gloucester, Massachusetts,
Oh, yeah.
so like this is stuff I kind of grew up learning about just in my childhood. So it's really cool to see how like global it's become. Just because like I come from a fishing family, like I know it all. So it's really cool to be able to see like how other people interpret it.
Well, I bought my first pair of Fallies in Gloucester, and I still have the Sou'wester. Yeah, thank you for that. That's, I think when I first started doing the history work I do, I had people say, well, you can't write history about that. The deep sea is not something you can write history about. And then they would say, well, are you writing American history or British history? Because you got to pick. And nobody says that anymore. So that's a win, right? We get, we can write about these places and these topics that are, that historians 20, 30 years ago would have just said, that's not history. So, and I mean, to the connections theme, that's because interdisciplinary scholarship has helped it be possible to do things like the kind of history that I do and the kind of scholarship these other blue humanists do. So,
stay a little further away. So we have a very strong marine science program here at the University of New England, but it's marine science. I mean, we also have marine affairs, but we don't really get into history as much as I think I would like us to. What are your suggestions, or how have you partnered with the marine science at UConn? And what lessons have you learned that we could maybe apply here at the University of New England?
Well, I'll start by saying I wish that there had been more connection, frankly, even on our tiny little campus. The Marine Science Building is the big one in the foreground, and the rest of it is, everybody else. But I will say I was contacted, for example, by the graduate student the Marine Science Graduate Student Organization to come talk to them about racism in oceanography because of a piece I published in co-wrote and published in Oceanography magazine about Matthew Fontaine-Maury and the extent to which his ideological commitment to racial slavery was mixed up with his science and what we should do about that, knowing that. So that was an interesting conversation to have. And then, over the years, once, I remember working with a fisheries scientist graduate student years ago because she wanted to do a historical part of her, I think it was a Ph.D., not a master's dissertation. So that, there have been bits and pieces, but it's hard, because the marine scientists are super busy all the time, and I'm just a few buildings over, but we don't always talk. And we don't have, we don't really have any common place where we eat meals or anything like that. So you have to really kind of intentionally do it. I would say on my campus, one of the places where it does happen is a spring lecture series where we bring mostly in outside people, but it's a place where we see people across disciplines that include the sciences and the social sciences and humanities. So sometimes we have conversations there, but not as much as we should be doing.
All right, I think we are out of time, but thank you everyone for coming, and let's give a round of applause to Dr. Rozwadowski.
Well, thank you all so much.
Thank you so much.